Welcome to Pod Junction Podcast, where podcasters learn to grow their business. My name is Sada Fainin, and beside me is Matt, the Maxnificent.
How long have you been practicing that?
Just came to my head before.
Brilliant. Welcome, everybody. It's good to be here with you. Matt, the Maxnificent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You like it?
Yeah. You're going to have to explain it now, though.
Well, Matt has a nickname that someone gave him. It wasn't
I don't know
me.
if someone gave it to me.
Oh, why don't you tell the story then?
It's just
How did it come about?
when people say, what's your name? And I say Matt, that my accent, for whatever reason, half the population of the world thinks I'm saying Max. And so, to half the world, I'm known as Max Edmondson. Although Max is a cool name.
That Max is a cool name.
Yeah, I'd be quite happy with the name Max. Maybe I should change it. No, I like Matt better. But anyway.
So yeah.
That's why.
Yes.
Maximilian.
Maxnificent. Is that...
Brilliant. Oh, dear. Love
All right.
that.
So
anyway.
Today we're in part 3 of our 4-part series of insights with Jaryd Krause, who is the host of Buying Online Businesses podcast.
Yeah, legend.
Yes. And in this episode, you're going to learn why being smart about guest selection adds value to your listeners. You're going to learn why it's important to curate content that directly serves your audience. And finally, you're going to learn how to actively find and bring on high-value guests that build credibility for your podcast.
Ooh. Can we just skip to point 3?
No.
I'm sure the other 2 are good as well. I jest. So anyway, are we going to get straight into it? Or is there anything happening between now and that clip?
No, we can get into it.
Yeah, are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, here's a clip. We'll be back after this.
So, Jaryd, something that you said to me in our pre-call was that you're very selective about the guests that you invite onto the show.
Yes.
So I want to know more about that. Tell us about the criteria you use.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we get pitched for people to come on the podcast a lot. I don't know anymore how much because I don't monitor those emails anymore, thank God. But we say no to every single person as a baseline.
Okay.
Typically. I think there's maybe one person out of like many years that I've said, yeah, let's get this person on. Typically we'll say no as a baseline. And we go out and find the guests ourselves. So I have somebody that will go out and they'll look for different pieces of content around buying businesses, scaling different types of business models in different ways with different strategies, and then also exiting businesses. And in the M&A space, so mergers and acquisitions. And she will go away and get a bunch of them, and then she'll give me their LinkedIn, their email, and then where she found them, what they talk about and what they're about. And I'll go through it and I'll look at those, and this will typically be like once every 2 weeks. She give me a big long list. I'll go through, look at those, and I'll approve maybe half and then disclude half. And the ones I disclude, I might come back to at a different time. Some are just a hard no. And basically my criteria is that I go look at them and ask, have they bought a business before? And if so, is it going to be valuable for me interviewing them for my audience? Have they sold a business before? And the same question, is it going to be valuable? And then if they've grown a business, like if they're a digital marketer, what sort of growth strategies have they used based on what sort of business models they've used those growth strategies on to grow them? And are those business models that I typically talk about in my podcast? And if it's outside of that, then I don't typically get them on. For example, sometimes if somebody's like, I've got a book about, personal development and I've helped people with startups, right? I'm not going to get that person on because I'm against startups. 90% of all startups fail. That's my message. Why not go away and buy one that's past that 90% failure rate? You don't have to go through it yourself. So I don't talk to people in tech startups. I don't talk to people anywhere about startups. Somebody wants to start a business and they email me and they're, Jaryd, like, let's get on your podcast. I want to help people start a great business. I'm like, no, we don't do that here. We buy them. So nobody with startups, nobody with just like trying to push something that is not going to be right for my audience. The biggest criteria is sitting in the shoes of my audience. Like, they're trying to achieve one goal.
Yeah.
Typically. At first it was starting a bit, not starting. First it was acquiring a business. And then they went, all right, Chad, we've bought business. Now we need to grow them. And then it's the sailing. And so there's 3 different goals for my audience now. It's like acquiring, scaling, and exiting. So mostly we talk about acquiring and exiting because the growing can change depending on the business model. But if we do talk about growing, there's only a select few sort of growth strategies we do talk about, which is like email marketing, SEO, content marketing, and some ads. For just 3 different type of business models. So that's pretty much the criteria. Is the number one thing is like, is it going to be right for my audience?
Did you always do that? Because that's time consuming, isn't it?
Did I always do that? I have with the podcast. Yeah.
So you've, right from day one, you always went and found your own guests. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yes, actually I did. Yeah. I did outreach at the start. And I was very lucky that I had been sort of doing this for a couple of years in the space, that people already knew my name a little bit. So I was able to get some big wigs on the podcast, some big guests in terms of like, I'm not sure if you've heard of flipper.com and it's the largest marketplace for buying and selling online businesses. I actually became friends with the new CEO that came on. He came on the podcast very early. And then when you get one like good guest like that, then you get a bunch of other big CEOs and founders of companies come on to talk about buying and selling and exiting businesses. And I've always gone and selected them.
If that got you curious and you want to catch the full episode, be sure to subscribe to the show. We've got plenty more great conversations coming up.
Hello and welcome back. We were just chatting away about the website flipper.com.
Yes.
Is it Flipper or Flipper?
It's Flipper. With an A.
Oh, Flipper with an A.
Yeah, not an ER. It's not flipper.com.
Right. Okay. And you were fact checking that.
I was. Well, I just wanted to make sure I was yeah, that's right.
Okay. That's just good to know.
Accents need to
clarify. So she says with an accent.
Yes.
I don't have an accent.
No comment.
Max. I don't have an accent, but half the people can't understand me. He says. So welcome back. That was Jaryd talking about his podcast and how he goes and gets guests. So like you said, this is part 3. And what I didn't do before we played the videos is say welcome to everybody. Welcome if you're a first-time visitor. We always like to make our first-time visitors welcome. So, or first-time listener, should I say. If you're a first-time listener, do make sure you like and subscribe to the show. The way this works is we play clips like we've just played with. I should have said this before the start. We're totally professional. But we play clips and then we just sort of chat about it and how it's going to work for us and what lessons we can learn from it in podcasting. Now, obviously the big insight here is Jaryd gets every single guest. And you asked the same question I would have asked in that situation. That sounds like a lot of work. Yeah. It really sounds like a lot of work. So, but it is obviously paying dividends for him because he's getting great guests on his show. Yeah. As he was talking, the more he was talking, the more flattered I was that I've actually been a guest on his show. I'm like, somebody somewhere has researched me and thought he's worthy to reach out to. And so, yeah, it's fascinating. Absolutely. So he's obviously got some help. Did he say if that was a VA or is?
No, he didn't. He's got a team.
He's got a team.
He's got a team of people.
And they obviously go and research guests based on what they've put out content-wise. Yeah. So it's really interesting. Yeah. It does sound like a lot of hard work, but I get why he's doing it if you want to maintain the consistency of the guest.
Yeah. And it also speaks to what he was saying about creating content that's going to resonate with the audience. So like he says no to everyone as a baseline. And especially people who are off topic. So if they're wanting startups or anything that doesn't align with his audience's, the direction of his podcast, he says no to. Yeah.
I liked his phrase, I'm against startups.
Yeah.
It's like, can you just imagine him protesting with a little picket sign, I'm against startups. But yeah, okay. So this is interesting, isn't it? And again, I think it depends here now on the strategy that you use. So if I think about push, we go and get all the guests. Usually, actually, we've had one or two people apply to be on the show, which we've accepted, right? Pod Junction, we go and get all the guests from our connections. So far, that's what we've done. EP, e-commerce podcasts.
They come to us mostly.
Mostly they come to us and apply to be on the show. So we're using either the same strategy, a hybrid of this strategy, or completely not this strategy.
Yeah, depending on the podcast. Yeah.
And so with Push, we go after people we want on the show because we are targeting, should I say? I'm hearing the words in my head as I'm saying them, going, that doesn't sound right. You have an accent. But on Push, we are targeting specific people who we think we could, like ideal clients, aren't we, basically? So we look at people and go, could we work with these people, yes or no? Let's go and invite them on the show and see what happens, right? Whereas with EP, historically, although things are changing, historically we've always wanted to grow the audience of that show, which means delivering value. So bringing guests with valuable content. But because of the way the market is, we rarely have to go hunt for people. They they hunt for us.
I think also with EP, it's a bit more open-ended in the sense that it's all about e-commerce, and e-commerce is quite big.
It's quite a broad topic.
Yeah. So, a lot of those topics are kind of, fair game.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the differences between what Jaryd's doing and what we're doing on EP.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's an interesting one, isn't it? And I don't know if I'd change it for EP to this strategy. But with EP, we are now being... Sorry, EP stands for e-commerce podcast, if you don't know. This is internal jargon, which is one of the podcasts that I host. With that show, we are actively starting to pursue guests because we want founders to come on the show.
Yeah.
And we rarely get people who are founders asking if they can come on, mainly because we've never really had founders featured on the show.
Yeah.
So we are actively going out and pursuing people. How we find them. I think this is always an interesting question, isn't it? How do you find the guests? So what was it Jaryd said? He has somebody who basically searches the internet for people who have put out content about how they have either sold, scaled, or exited. Sorry, acquired scaled, or exited their business. So they're his sort of three criteria, which I think is quite interesting. So he understands his criteria, and he goes out and searches people who have written about in some form or another one of those three things. Well, a member of his team does. She obviously then compiles a list with LinkedIn and email, which Jaryd then goes through, and then he'll say yes to about half of them. So they're obviously whittling it down along the way. So I think that's a really interesting way of doing it, though. I mean, fundamentally, you are searching the web for people who are putting out content similar to what it is you want to talk about on your podcast, and reaching out to those people. I think that's a pretty sound strategy for the type of podcast he wants to do, right?
Yeah. I think I was quite impressed, actually. I am impressed. Like, I think he's quite dedicated to his audience by doing that, like trying to find people to guest that are going to speak directly to the audience's needs. I think we spoke about this last time, didn't we? Like what their pain points are. And I think that's really big. Because it's so easy, especially when you're putting out an episode every week. Just like, I just need someone to be on the other end of that mic so that we can have an episode. So I think that's really good.
There is that temptation, isn't there? When you podcast and you're short on episodes, you're like, right, we'll just get anybody to come onto the show because we need to keep the episodes pumping out. I think it's always a temptation to do that. And I think my experience here is when you do that, the content's never quite as good. And I do think sometimes you're better off not doing the episode than just trying to get any old person to come on the show, right?
I think I don't know if there's any weight to this, but I wonder if the host, like the quality of the host, has any kind of impact on a guest that you're just putting on for the sake of having someone.
Yeah.
So whether they can kind of carry them a bit more, and I don't know.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to articulate exactly. But I'm just wondering whether the quality of the host has a role to play in it as well. It's not just the guest and what they're talking about necessarily.
Yeah, and I think that comes with experience, doesn't it? I think you can be, if you're a great host, you can take an okay guest and you can make them sound good.
Yeah.
Because you know the question to ask, right?
Yeah.
If you're a bad host or an inexperienced host maybe, and you get a great guest, usually that can work as well, because the guest can steer kind of can steer the conversation well enough.
Yeah.
It's where you have an okay host and a really poor guest that it starts to become quite sticky, right? And so I guess if you are in this place where you go, I just need to get someone on the show, I suppose that, like you say, that also comes down to how well you can host, right? So I'm fairly confident that I can take most people and get them to sound interesting. There's been one or two people where I've failed miserably. But I'm fairly sure I can do that. I think the other thing you can do, we're sort of going off piste a little bit here, but the other thing that you can do rather than getting a guest is just do a solo show.
Yeah.
And I think you can, like when we've struggled for episodes, we've either replayed past episodes or you can say, right, we're on episode 20, episodes 10 through 20, I'm just going to do a solo show and I'm going to pull out key points from each of those episodes and just talk about them. And I think that's fine. I think as long as 90% of the time your show is pretty much the same format, I think people don't mind a little bit of nuance and difference.
Yeah.
So why being smart about guest selection adds value to your listeners? I think we've covered that point, haven't we? Because you're bringing the best content fundamentally, and you're bringing the best people to talk about what matters most to your guests.
Yeah.
And that's what Jaryd is obviously doing. He has been super smart about guest selection, which brings total value to his listeners.
Yeah.
Why it's important to curate content that directly serves your audience. And we talked about that last time as well, didn't we? A little.
Yeah, we did. We did touch on it. So when I was saying about pain points and talking to the audience and what their needs are, it's similar to that, isn't it? Curating it for your audience. I think though what it does is it builds a loyal listenership that you wouldn't be able to build otherwise, because they know what they're coming for, they know what they're gonna get, and have an idea of how they can probably go back and apply it. Yeah. So
there's this thing called, have we talked about the theory of eights on this podcast?
No, not that.
I can't remember. No. I really can't. So the theory of eights is a really interesting theory. And I wish I could take credit for this, but I genuinely can't. I totally robbed it from an interview I heard between two people chatting away about an in-person experience that they were trying to do at an event. And they were talking about how when you do these events, you're trying to create an experience that's like a 10 out of 10, right? You want this excellence, but the trouble was 10 out of 10 is insanely difficult to deliver. And your team struggles, you get burnout, everything becomes about that experience. And so what tends to happen is you create experiences which one week could be a 10 out of 10, but the next week might be a 7 out of 10. And of course, everyone's devastated, or devoled, as they say in Liverpool, devoled, lads. You're sort of devastated that actually it was a 7 out of 10, right? And so what you find by trying to achieve this state of perfection, this total state of excellence, is it becomes hard to deliver week in, week out, week in, week out. And you see a lot of content creators now stepping away because they can't keep up with the demands of that constantly all the time. And it's an insane thing to do in some respects. So the argument was it's much better to aim for an 8 out of 10, right? And so if you can create an 8 out of 10 experience, Well, 8 out of 10 allows for some discrepancy. It allows for some failure. For example, me not welcoming first-time listeners to the show before we played the video. Well, okay, that takes it down a point. But can we still deliver 8 out of 10, yes or no? What that does, it gives you a little bit of room for maneuver, but it enables you to create a consistency, which I think is super important in the quality of your content. And that's how I approach it. I'm not aiming for the 10 out of 10 experience. And some may criticize this, some may argue with it. But here we are, having done thousands of episodes, or hundreds, if not thousands of episodes later. I still quite enjoy it. I'm not burnt out by it. Yeah. I'm not, having to now go and spend 40 grand on new equipment because I need a better stage or all that sort of stuff. We're quite happy with that. It's not that we don't try and improve. We're constantly trying to improve. Hence the reason we've got a 3-camera shot in this studio now. But I think it's easier to hit that 8 out of 10. Does that make sense? Yeah. So creating that consistency. And so when you're serving your audience and delivering value to your audience and you're looking for guests, if they deliver a 10 out of 10, that's awesome. But what you're aiming for is the 8 out of 10, right? And can you deliver that? Mm-hmm. And I think that's so important, which is why I think Jaryd's methodology for his audience is totally correct. This curation, I think curation is a really interesting word. I'm going to curate the content. I think of when I hear curator, I think of a museum. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? And very careful curation of artifacts and pieces. And I think that's actually how you are curating that content, being that kind of steward of the content to serve your audience, to deliver that 8 out of 10 experience. I think is super, super important.
Yeah.
So how to actively find and bring on high value guests to build credibility was point number 3. Mm-hmm. What were your takeaways?
Overall, you're talking about takeaways? Sure. Yeah, I think for me...
Well, and how to do that? How do you find and bring on high value guests?
I think looking for... So you've got to... I guess you kind of work backwards, I would. Where you're trying to build the credibility of your podcast and the impact of your podcast. So how do you do that? You want to have certain kinds of conversations. Who's going to give you those conversations? And it's not just that, it's also the name that comes with it. Yeah. And the influence, quote unquote, that comes with it. And so, and then finding those people. So whether that's a friend of a friend or, someone that knows someone else or whatever that takes, you go out and find them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think it is, like you say, you start backwards. So the credibility, good guests bring credibility to your show. Mm-hmm. My advice is, again, you can spend a lot of time chasing the big names. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that at all. I think getting big names on your podcast is really good. And I think it opens the doors to a lot of things when you do that. But I think certainly if you're starting out, you're going to find it hard to get big names for every episode. Mm-hmm. Not impossible, but hard. And so this is where actually your network pays dividends, right? So if you're starting out or you're new to a podcast and you've got some big names in that, maybe they're quite happy to help you out in the early days.
Yeah, I think help you out is a pretty key phrase there. Because I think from my experience, I remember back in the days of when e-commerce podcast was first getting off the ground, it was really hard to find people of influence that would be happy to come on there. I mean, they didn't know us from Adam. I just reached out to randoms that I thought would be good. And they wanted us to have like 100 episodes in the bag before we were to, they said we just don't interview with people unless there's 100 episodes or something. So
yeah, some people are like that, aren't they? And that's okay. I mean, they've got to, they've got to protect themselves a little bit, I suppose. So I don't think it hurts to ask the question, but I think, again, aim for 8 out of 10, right? So I don't necessarily always need the big names, but when we get them, that's great. But we want to make sure that when we get guests on, we're getting that 8 out of 10. Yeah. So actively find and bring on high value guests. I think this is an interesting point, that word actively, because with EP, they now do come to us. As in, we get a lot of people applying to be on the show. I assume we do. I don't actually know because I don't see it. apart from the odd email that for some reason turns up in my inbox. I'm not quite sure how that's happened. But we get people apply, but you still have to be actively finding the guests in those applications.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, they're all great because, well, they're not, right? I guess there's some kind of, well, I don't know, there's some kind of filter. Yeah.
I'm the filter.
The Bane on filter.
Yeah.
And so there has to be some proactivity in this. There has to be some kind of effort.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that's really important to understand, especially if you're starting out in podcasting, that it takes effort to get guests on your show. You're going to have to put the work in. Yeah. It's not a piece of cake unless you're just like hyper connected and you can send a text message out to anybody and they'll say yes.
Yeah.
You know, people like Sean can do that. You know, a friend of mine, he seems to be able to do things like that. But I think on the whole, there has to be some kind of activity. So whether they're coming to you because they're applying to be on the show, or whether you're connecting with people, there's effort, there's work, right? And so don't underestimate that. And I think doing that well, filtering well, not being afraid to say no, and getting the right people on the show will ultimately add the best value to your podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. I think something that stuck out to me was how Jaryd has his audience at the heart of his content planning.
Yeah.
Like all of these points, if you look at them, they all kind of go back to that, don't they? Like he's always got the audience in mind. How is this going to help them?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. And that's definitely his style of podcast. I mean, for some of you, it may be, it's not so much about the audience, it's more about the guest.
Yeah.
And you're focusing on the guest rather than the audience, you're going down that strategy. And that's cool. But this, I think, becomes even more important if that's your strategy, because you want to work hard to understand who your ideal guest is and are they aligning to that, yes or no, right? Yeah. And if the answer is no, you're gonna struggle a little bit. But that said, if you think about push, right? So we want people to come on that podcast that don't actually have a podcast, who we think could have a podcast and will end up becoming a PodJunction client, right? And so if you don't know, PodJunction has services that help CEOs, business leaders get their own podcast up and running. It's kind of what we do in the background. It's where we make money ourselves. And so when we get people on the podcast as a way to sort of build a network and, you know, do the strategies and the stuff which we teach, we've had guests on the show who actually have a podcast. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And I think that's been part of the learning, hasn't it? It's like, actually, I found it interesting to talk to these people. And I think they've added some value to the show and to the audience that now listen to the show, because obviously you build an audience. But will they ever end up working with us? Probably not. Yeah. And so I think just thinking it through, we should probably be a little bit more, now I think we're established that podcast, I think we could be a bit more selective there. But but that would be actively finding. That would be a check mark. Do they have a podcast? Yes or no? Yes. Well, we're not really interested in talking. Unless it's inactive or they're not doing very well with it, in which case maybe we can help them.
And then if they have a podcast, they could be a PodJunction guest. So.
Well, that's true. So many cross-pollinations now with the different podcasts. So yes, brilliant. So anything else to add on this?
No, not for me.
So what's coming up next week?
Next week is the fourth and final part with Jaryd.
And he's talking about?
Production.
So you know.
Yeah.
Well, hey. So we're going to be talking about production with Jaryd. I thought I was going to try and catch you out. Obviously it didn't work. Never mind. I'll try harder next time. So do come join us next time as we carry on our conversation with Jaryd, part 4 of his conversation. But yeah, I think are we going to wrap up now?
Yeah, we're going to wrap up.
We're going to wrap up. So thank you so much for joining us. As I said, make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. We're just really enjoying what we're doing, if I'm honest with you. So hopefully you're enjoying it as well. Well, I'm enjoying it. Are you enjoying it?
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, usually. So yeah, do follow along with the journey. Do reach out to us. If you've got any questions, thoughts, comments, you can find both myself and Sadaf on LinkedIn. You can come join us there. I think I'm on Instagram. You're on Instagram? Yeah, Podjunction is on Instagram.
Podjunction.
I can't remember which of our
Podjunction.
podcasts is on Instagram. Anyway, come find us. Do connect with us. Let us know your thoughts, questions, or comments. Did you see what somebody wrote on? Was it YouTube? One of the videos the other day about. I can't remember what it said. It was. It made me laugh. It's like, you could not pay me.
Oh yes. Was it YouTube or Instagram? I don't know.
I can't remember. Somebody took the
did.
time to write a comment which made me laugh. It said, "You cannot pay me to listen to this."
Listen to this.
The irony was not lost on me. So I was like, "Oh, this is really interesting." So surely you've listened to it to come to this conclusion, but that's another story. And I was very tempted to write a comment back, going, "Well, that was that plan out the window. I was going to offer you some money, but obviously that's a waste of time. But thanks anyway. Thanks for saving me a few quid."
I did see that.
So yeah, that did make me chuckle. So we obviously get the moaners and the haters, which is fine. You know, I don't mind that at all. But if you want to connect with us on LinkedIn or Instagram, just especially to Sadaf, be nice. Would be my only request. Be gentle, be kind.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And of course, you can find all the notes, all the links to Jaryd and all that sort of good stuff in the show notes, which you can get on the website at podjunction.com. If you're subscribed to the newsletter, it'll be in your inbox. And of course, just do what I do. Is that I shouldn't say this because obviously we want people to sign up to our newsletter or go to the website because you see all the other stuff. But it's one of those things I almost feel like a fraud asking people to do it, because you literally can just scroll down on your podcast player app and see the show notes, right? Mm-hmm. And the show notes contain the link. So, which is exactly what I do. So, however you get your content, however you follow us and join us, thanks for being part of the journey. Do connect with Jaryd. I'm sure I'd love to hear from you, but that's it from me. That's it from Sadaf. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a fantastic week wherever you are in the world. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode at Pod Junction. If you've enjoyed the insights from this episode and want to hear the full conversation with today's special guest, don't forget to visit podjunction.com, where you'll find more information about how you can join Pod Junction cohort. Whether you listened while on the go or in a quiet moment, thank you for letting us be a part of your day. Remember, every episode is a chance to gain insights and to transform your business with podcasting. So keep on tuning in, keep on learning, and until next time, happy podcasting.